In the year 1288, beneath the murky waters of a Vietnamese river, death waited silently. 1,000 sharpened wooden stakes, of each one meticulously placed in precision, laid angled with deadly hidden just below the surface. The Mongol Empire, masters of the known world, were about to discover that sometimes the most devastating weapons are ones you never see coming. This is the story of the Battle of Bung, where Vietnamese ingenuity turned simple wooden poles into the most effective naval defense in medieval history, where a smaller force didn't just survive impossible against odds, but completely annihilated one of the most powerful fleets ever assembled. By the time the tide receded on April 9th, 1288, the river would run red with blood, and the course history would be Asian of Southeast, changed forever. The Mongol Empire, 1288, was unlike anything in the world had ever seen. Stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, largest contiguous land empire in human was the history. Under Kublai Khan, China, the Yuan dynasty had conquered and subjugated Korea, subbed their sights on the rich kingdoms of Southeast Asia. Their military machine was unproven operable, their tactics across countless battlefields, and their ambition knew no bounds kingdom. Yet there was one small that dared to defy them. Đại Việt, modern Vietnam, ruled northern by the Trần dynasty, had already repelled two obsessed this massive Mongol invasions. But Kublai Khan was tiny kingdom, barely an empire's fraction of his size, had humiliated his forces twice. The third invasion would be different. This time, he would bring such overwhelming force that resistance would be impossible. The scale of the invasion, 1287, was staggering. Between 100,000 and 170,000 Yuan soldiers were mobilized for the campaign. The naval component alone consisted of 500 warships, 100 soldiers, 70 transport vessels, and 18, not counting the thousands of sailors required to operate such a massive fleet. This was not merely an invasion. It was a statement of imperial power designed to crush Vietnamese resistance once and for all. But the Mongols had underestimated their enemy. Leading the Vietnamese defense, Trần Hưng Đạo was Tro, a military name genius whose would echo through history. Born around 1229 more, he was than just a general, he was a masterist, whose strateg understood that conventional warfare against the Mongol war machine was suicide forces. His smaller self could never match the enemy in battle. Even if he won, he could not defeat him. Trần Hưng Đạo was revolutionary. While warfare European knights were still charging headlong into enemy pioneer lines, he had guerrilla tactics that would be military strateged by studiists centuries later. He understood that mobility and local knowledge were force multipliers that could overcome numerical disadvantages. When the Mongol land forces invaded the Red River Valley in the earlier campaigns had given, he ground before attempting a defensive, adopt strategy that used hit score and run tactics untold policies to wear down the invaders. The scorched earth strategy was particularly brutal its effectiveness. Trần Hưng Đạo ordered his forces to destroy crops, livestock, and any resources that could sustain Mongol army. Villages were evacuated, wells poisoned, and entire regions were stripped bare of useful, anything to an occupying force. The Mongols found themselves in a hostile land where every hide tree cool and ambush, every village deserted, and every meal to be carried from increasingly distant supply lines. By 1288, Trần Hưng Đạo woe coming. The Mongol Sation was confront that the finale knew this time there yet, and bring their largest force would coordinate land and sea assaults to the countryside, prevent the Vietnamese from melting away into. He needed a battlefield where he could neutralize their numerical advantage and turn their strength against them. He found it in the Bach Dang River. The Bach Dang River was no strategic ordinary waterway. It was Vietnam's gateway to the east, the key sea passage that connected the northern delta to the ancient capital of Thang Long through a network of tribute, the Rieries, including centuries, northern river. For this river as their invasion dynasties had chosen route, making it hallowed ground for Vietnamese defenders. The river was deceptively tray-wide butcherous, with shallow fords scattered throughout its length, and that could dramatic tidal variations transformed the entire battlefield in a matter of hours. But Trần Hưng Đạo had another advantage that went beyond geography. This was not the first time Vietnamese forces had used the Bach Dang River to destroy and blasting. Three invading fleet 150 years earlier, in 938 Ha, Ngô Quyền employed a nearly identical strategy against the Chinese Southern Han dynasty, using iron-tipped stakes hidden beneath the water to impale enemy warships when the tide receded. The tactic had worked so perfectly that it entered Vietnamese military folklore, passed down through generations of commanders who understood that sometimes ways were the best ways. Beginning the Olin, March 1288, Trần Hưng Đạo initiated one of the most remarkable preparation phases in military under history. Working the cover of darkness and during low tide periods, Vietnamese engineers began installing thousands of wooden stakes across strategic sections of the river. These were not simple wooden poles driven randomly into the riverbed. Each stake was precisely positioned, carefully angled, and engineered for maximum devastation. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed the sophisticated engineering behind this seemingly simple defense. The stakes were made from ironwood, a material chosen for its incredible durability and resistance to water damage. Each pole was planted 2.5 meters deep into the riverbed, with holes drilled at the top to assist with leverage during installation. The stakes varied in size, with diameters ranging from 20 to 50 centimeters and some reaching nearly 5 meters in length. They were positioned 5 to 7 meters apart in carefully calculated patterns. The positioning was not random. Some stakes were planted vertically while others were angled. 15 Tod, the southwest, directly 20 degrees tower opposing the flow of the river and the expected direction of the Mongol fleet's advance. The angles were calculated to maximize when the impact heavy warships, pushed by tide and current, would crash into them with their full weight and momentum. The construction phase required months of back-breaking labor, all conducted in absolute secrecy. Vietnamese workers had to time their efforts precisely with tidal patterns, working in the narrow windows when the water was low enough to allow construction, but not so low that their activities would be visible to Mongol scouts. The stakes had to be positioned at exactly the right depth, visible enough during low tide to create the trap, but hidden enough during high tide to remain undetected until it was too late. Trần Hưng Đạo intimate knowledge of local tidal patterns was crucial to the plan's success. He understood that the Bach Dang River had significant tidal variations that could change water levels dramatically over just a few hours. During high tide, the stakes would be completely submerged, allowing light Vietnamese vessels to pass over them safely. During low tide, they would be exposed like a forest of spears, making the river impassable for any large vessel. The psychological preparation was as important as the physical construction. Trần Hưng Đạo knew that his plan required perfect timing and absolute discipline from his forces. They would have to engage a vastly superior enemy fleet, conduct a fighting retreat that would appear genuine to the Mongols, and time their movements precisely to coincide with tidal changes. Any mistake in timing or execution would result in disaster for the Vietnamese forces. As the Mongol fleet approached in early April 1288, everything was in place. The stakes waited beneath the dark waters like silent sentinels, each one a promise of destruction for the enemy vessels that would soon follow the Vietnamese into their carefully prepared trap. The Mongol commanders had no idea what awaited them in the murky waters ahead. Admiral Omar, leading the Yuan naval forces alongside Admiral Phan Yi, commanded a fleet that represented the pinnacle of 13th century naval power. These were not mere riverboats, but massive warships designed to carry hundreds of warriors each, their hulls reinforced for ramming enemy vessels, their decks bristling with crossbowmen and siege engines. The confidence of the Mongol admirals was absolute. They had crushed naval forces from Korea to Java, and this small Vietnamese fleet appeared to be nothing more than an inconvenience before their inevitable victory. The morning of April 9th, 1288, dawned with deceptive calm over the Bach Dang River. Mist clung to the water's surface, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that belied the violence about to unfold. The tide was high, and the river appeared deep and navigable, exactly as Trần Hưng Đạo had planned. Beneath the placid surface, Thousands of ironwood stakes waited in perfect formation, invisible to the approaching enemy, but positioned with deadly precision for the trap that was about to spring. The Vietnamese fleet that emerged to meet the Mongols was deliberately modest. Small junks and light vessels, seemingly outnumbered and outgunned, appeared almost hesitant as they approached the massive Yuan armada. To the Mongol commanders, this confirmed their expectations. The Vietnamese were clearly desperate, throwing together whatever vessels they could muster for one final, futile stand. What the Mongols couldn't see was the careful choreography behind every movement of the Vietnamese fleet. Trần Hưng Đạo had positioned himself where he could observe the entire battlefield while remaining hidden from enemy scouts. His understanding of the river's tidal patterns was so complete that he could predict almost to the minute when the water would begin to recede. Every Vietnamese captain had been briefed on the precise timing required for the plan to succeed. They would engage the enemy just long enough to draw them into the stake field, then execute a fighting retreat that would appear genuine while actually serving as bait for the trap. The initial engagement began exactly as planned. Vietnamese vessels darted forward, launching volleys of arrows and fire projectiles at the Mongol fleet before quickly withdrawing. The attacks were more harassment than serious assault, designed to provoke rather than destroy. Mongol pride, already stung by previous defeats in Vietnam, demanded immediate retaliation. Admiral Omar ordered his fleet to pursue the retreating Vietnamese vessels, confident that his heavier warships would quickly overtake and destroy the lighter enemy craft. The Mongol fleet surged forward with devastating momentum. Hundreds of warships, their banners snapping in the morning breeze, their crews shouting battle cries in a dozen different languages, advanced up the river in pursuit of what appeared to be a fleeing enemy. The water was still high enough for their deep-hulled vessels to navigate safely, and the Vietnamese boats ahead seemed to be struggling to maintain their distance. Victory appeared certain and imminent, but Trần Hưng Đạo was counting every minute, every inch of water level. His scouts had been monitoring the tide since dawn, and he before knew exactly when the river would begin its deadly transformation. The Vietnamese vessels, with their shallow drafts and intimate knowledge of every sandbar and channel, could navigate waters that would trap heavier ships. As they led the Mongol fleet deeper into the river, they were actually guiding them into the killing ground. The tide began to turn with almost imperceptible subtlety. At first, the change was barely noticeable, just a slight shift in current direction and a gradual reduction in water depth. The Mongol vessels continued their pursuit, their commanders focused on closing the distance with the enemy rather than monitoring the river conditions. The Vietnamese captains, however, were acutely aware of every change in the water level. They began to increase their speed, not from panic, but from careful calculation. As the water continued to recede, the first hints of the trap began to emerge. Sharp points started to break the surface in isolated spots, looking like natural obstacles or driftwood to the untrained eye. The Vietnamese vessels, guided by generations of local knowledge, wove between these emerging hazards with practiced ease. The Mongol fleet, heavy and less maneuverable, found navigation becoming increasingly difficult but pressed on, driven by the momentum of their charge and the apparent weakness of their fleeing enemy. Then the trap revealed itself in all its terrible glory. As the tide dropped further, the full extent of the stake field became visible. What had appeared to be navigable water just minutes earlier was now revealed as a forest of sharpened death. Thousands of ironwood stakes, each one positioned with mathematical precision, rose from the riverbed like the spines of some massive underwater creature. The stakes were angled perfectly to catch vessels moving downstream, their iron-tipped points glinting in the morning sun as they emerged from the receding waters. The realization hit the Mongol fleet like a physical blow. Trapped between the stakes ahead and the narrowing river behind them, the massive warships found themselves in an impossible situation. The deeper-hulled vessels were the first to strike the hidden obstacles, their momentum driving them hard onto the sharpened points. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the water as hull after hull was pierced by the stakes. Some vessels impaling themselves so completely that they were lifted partially out of the water. Panic spread through the Mongol fleet faster than fire. Ships crashed into each other as they tried desperately to reverse course, but the river had become a maze of destruction. The stakes were positioned too closely together for large vessels to navigate tide between them, and the wreck was exposing more obstacles with every had begun as an passing minute. What orderly pursuit had transformed into chaos in a matter of moments? The Vietnamese fleet, having safely cleared the stake field, turned to deliver the final blow. No longer retreating, they attacked with devastating precision, launching fire arrows and incendiary materials at the trapped and immobilized Mongol vessels. The enemy ships, unable to maneuver or defend themselves effectively, became floating targets. Many of the Mongol warships had been so badly damaged by the stakes that they were already taking on water, their crews struggling to keep them afloat while under constant attack. Admiral Omar watched in horror as his magnificent fleet was systematically destroyed. Ships that had terrorized coastlines from China to Southeast Asia were being reduced to floating wreckage by an enemy they had vastly underestimated. The pride of the Yuan Navy, vessels that had cost fortunes to build and outfit, were sinking or burning in a river that had become their tomb. The slaughter continued throughout the day as the tide reached its lowest point, fully exposing the deadly forest of stakes that had claimed so many vessels. Vietnamese forces on the riverbanks joined the assault, raining arrows and stones down on the trapped Mongols while preventing any attempt at organized escape. The river itself had become an ally to the defenders, its changing levels serving as both trap and executioner. The carnage was absolute. By evening, the once mighty Yuan fleet had been reduced to burning wreckage scattered across the now shallow waters. Of the 500 warships that had entered the Bach Dang River that morning, not a single vessel escaped intact. Some had been impaled so completely on the stakes that they remained suspended above the waterline like grotesque monuments to Vietnamese ingenuity. Others had burned to the waterline, their charred hulks settling into the riverbed alongside the bodies of thousands of Yuan sailors and soldiers. Admiral Omar himself was dragged from the water, wounded and humiliated, to become a prisoner of the very forces he had come to crush. The man who had commanded fleets across the known world now found himself captive to what the Mongols had dismissed as a collection of river peasants. His capture was more than symbolic. It represented the complete collapse of Yuan naval power in Southeast Asia and the end of Kublai Khan's dreams of southern expansion. The human cost was staggering. Vietnamese chronicles record that the river ran red with blood for days after the battle. Bodies of Yuan soldiers floated downstream in such numbers that they clogged the river's tributaries. Some estimates place the death toll at over 30,000 Mongol troops, while others suggest the number was even higher. Entire units that had served the empire faithfully for decades were wiped out in a single day, their banners sinking beneath waters that had become a graveyard. But the true genius of Trần Hưng Đạo strategy extended beyond the immediate destruction of the fleet. The battle had been timed to coincide with the retreat of the Mongol land forces, who were already struggling with Vietnamese guerrilla tactics and scorched-earth policies. When news reached the land army that their entire naval support had been annihilated, morale collapsed completely. Supply lines that depended on river transport were severed, and the prospect of fighting their way back to China without naval cover became a nightmare scenario for the surviving commanders. The psychological impact rippled far beyond the battlefield itself. Across Southeast Asia, kingdoms that had trembled before Mongol power suddenly saw that the empire was not invincible. The defeat at Bach Dang became a rallying cry for resistance movements throughout the region. If tiny Vietnam could destroy a Mongol fleet using nothing but wooden stakes and clever tactics, what was possible for united resistance elsewhere? The reverberations reached all the way to Kublai Khan's court in Beijing. The emperor who had conquered China and brought the Song dynasty to its knees was forced to confront the humiliating reality that a kingdom he could barely locate on a map had dealt his empire one of its most devastating defeats. The loss of face was enormous in a culture where imperial prestige depended on the appearance of invincibility. Courtiers who had supported the Vietnamese campaigns found themselves reassigned or worse, while the emperor himself was forced to abandon his obsession with southern conquest. More practically, the destruction of the fleet represented an enormous economic loss for the Yuan dynasty. The warships alone had cost fortunes to build, outfit, and maintain. The trained sailors and marines who died in the river represented years of military investment that could never be recovered. The specialized knowledge of naval warfare that died with those men created gaps in Yuan military capability that would take decades to fill. if they could be filled at all. The defeat also exposed fundamental weaknesses in Mongol strategic thinking. The empire that had conquered most of the known world, through superior mobility and tactical flexibility, had been outmaneuvered by opponents who understood their local environment better than any foreign invader could. The Mongols had relied on overwhelming force and intimidation, but Vietnamese defenders had turned those very strengths into vulnerabilities through superior planning and intimate knowledge of their homeland. Archaeological evidence discovered centuries later would confirm the devastating effectiveness of the Vietnamese strategy. Excavations along the Bach Dang River have uncovered hundreds of the original stakes, some still bearing the scars of impact from Mongol vessels. Carbon dating has verified their age, while their positioning reveals the mathematical precision with which they were placed. The stakes were not randomly scattered, but formed carefully calculated killing fields designed to trap vessels of specific sizes, moving in predictable patterns. The discovery of these artifacts has allowed modern military historians to appreciate the sophistication of 13th century Vietnamese engineering. Each stake required precise calculations of tidal flow, current strength, and vessel displacement. The angles at which they were positioned had to account for the momentum of ships moving downstream, while ensuring maximum penetration of enemy hulls. This level of planning and execution rivals anything achieved by contemporary European or Chinese military engineers. The victory at Bach Dang also demonstrated the power of institutional memory in military affairs. The fact that Vietnamese commanders could successfully adapt and improve upon a tactic used 350 years earlier shows remarkable continuity in strategic thinking. Military knowledge was clearly being preserved and transmitted across generations, allowing each generation of defenders to build upon the experiences of their predecessors. This institutional learning gave Vietnamese forces advantages that extended far beyond individual battles. The international implications of the defeat were profound and lasting. The Mongol Empire's expansion had seemed unstoppable, creating a sense of inevitability about Yuan dominance throughout Asia. The destruction of the fleet at Bach Dang shattered that perception and encouraged resistance movements from Japan to Java. Other kingdoms began to study Vietnamese tactics, looking for ways to adapt guerrilla strategies to their own circumstances and terrain. For Vietnam itself, the victory established a template for national defense that would serve well the country in future conflicts. The principles demonstrated at Bach Dang, using local knowledge to overcome superior numbers, turning geography into a weapon, and maintaining discipline under extreme pressure, would be employed again and again by Vietnamese forces facing foreign invaders. The battle became a foundational myth of Vietnamese military culture, proof that clever strategy could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. The defeat marked the effective end of Mongol expansion into Southeast Asia. Kublai Khan would plan additional campaigns against Vietnam, but internal problems within the Yuan dynasty and the enormous cost of previous failures made further major expeditions impossible. The emperor, who had dreamed of adding all of Southeast Asia to his empire, was forced to accept that some prizes were beyond even Mongol reach. The wooden stakes of Bach Dang had accomplished what no army had managed before them. They had stopped the Mongol war machine in its tracks, using nothing more sophisticated than sharpened timber and perfect timing. In the annals of military history, few victories have been achieved through such elegant simplicity or had such far-reaching consequences. The silent killers beneath the water had spoken louder than any conventional weapon ever could. The strategic masterstroke at Bach Dang reverberated through the corridors of power across Asia, like thunder rolling through mountain valleys. In the imperial palaces of Beijing, courtiers who had once spoken confidently of Vietnamese conquest now whispered nervously about the implications of such a devastating defeat. The Yuan dynasty, which had built its reputation on the inevitability of Mongol victory, suddenly found itself confronting the uncomfortable reality that their empire was not invincible after all. The psychological warfare that followed the battle proved almost as destructive as the physical carnage. News of the fleet's destruction spread along trade routes faster than imperial messengers could carry official reports. Merchants, diplomats, and travelers carried tales of the river that had swallowed an entire armada, each retelling adding new layers of drama to an already incredible story. The narrative that emerged was not just about military defeat, but about the power of clever planning to overcome brute force. Throughout Southeast Asia, Kingdoms that had lived in fear of Mongol expansion began to reassess their defensive strategies. If Vietnamese engineers could turn a river into a weapon, what other natural features could be transformed into instruments of resistance? Mountain passes became potential ambush sites, coastal waters were viewed through new tactical lenses, and local knowledge suddenly became as valuable as traditional military equipment. The defeat had provided a blueprint for asymmetric warfare that would influence military thinking for centuries. The economic consequences rippled outward like waves from the battle site. The Yuan dynasty had invested enormous resources in shipbuilding, training naval personnel, and developing the logistics necessary to support overseas expeditions. The loss of 500 warships represented not just immediate military capability, but years of accumulated expertise and technological development. Skilled shipwrights, experienced admirals, and trained marines had all perished in the murky waters of a Vietnamese river, creating knowledge gaps that would take generations to fill. The wooden stakes of Bach Dang proved that sometimes the greatest victories come not from the clash of armies, but from the quiet brilliance of strategy. In a world where empires measured their strength in numbers and steel, a small kingdom showed that knowledge of the land and perfect timing could defeat any force. The silent killers beneath the water had delivered a message that would echo through history. No empire, no matter how mighty, is truly invincible.